questions? You told me that the people who are coming in on the web, they also want to follow the discussion period?
Yes.
So now they're on?
Not everyone back yet. As of now, it's 5 people on right now.
Okay. Anyway, we can start. Yeah.
Bhante,
Yeah.
I'm sorry to continue the topic. Just one more question.
Yeah.
If Bhante agrees, the reason that Bhante agrees with the mainstream of interpretation about the practitioner emerges from the jhana to contemplate the states, it's mainly because of the vichara and vitakka, the sustained thought and applied thought, their absence in the second jhana, and there's no way to give it a reasonable interpretation.
Yeah.
If one has to emerge from if one can't investigate the states in the jhana itself, but the definition of vitakka and vichara as sustained thought and applied thought, it's applied thought and sustained thought are not given in the sutta itself, right? The definition of those two words come from the later interpretation, like in the Abhidhamma literature, rather than the sutta itself, right? My point is, if we judge from the sutta itself, we cannot see that Sariputta emerged from the jhana to contemplate.
That's right. Yeah.
But then we should not distort or the passage itself in order to fit a definition that is derived from not the sutta itself.
Yeah.
You know my point?
I get your point.
Okay.
I mean, what can I say?
Okay, so probably the definition of probably vitakka and vichara have to be redefined.
Well, actually, the way vitakka and vichara are usually used, apart from the context of jhana, their function of what we would call discursive thinking is much more evident. For example, it's said that anuvitaketi, anuvichareti, vachang bindati, having thought and examined, one breaks out into speech. Therefore, vitakka and vichara are called the conditions for speech, the conditioned activities for speech, or conditioning activities for speech. And then we get expressions like kama vitakka, vyapada vitakka, vihingsa vitakka. Here, vitakka as the thought of sensuality, the thought of ill will, thought of harming. So it's much more like ordinary thought. So and then there are numbers of other passages which use vitakka, vichara in ways that bring it much more close to ordinary thinking, discursive thinking. And so vitakka, vichara in the first jhana would be like the furthest refinement of vitakka, vichara, to the point where we wouldn't even think of them. We wouldn't even consider them to be thinking in the ordinary sense of the word. So here the function of vitakka is just being reduced to like the bare minimum of directing the mind onto the object. And vichara is the bare minimum of inspecting, looking at, examining the object. And then in the second jhana and higher, they're gone. So as I said during the class, I just don't see how one could be sort of reflectively designating the different factors of experience and discursively considering now they're arising, now they're present, now they pass away, if vitakka and vichara are not present. But what I could see is that within the jhana, there'll be a very clear perception or cognition of the factors that are present, though one is not singling them out, but it's like a spotlight illuminating them, so that when one emerges from the jhana, then one can look back upon it and say, in that state, this was present, that was present, this was present, that was present. They didn't exist before, then they arose, then they passed away. Does that seem reasonable?
Because it's not, for me, it's difficult to believe that by contemplating something in the memory could help one, could make one breakthrough, to have the breakthrough.
I think Katie wants to say something.
I actually was going to ask about one of the translations as sustained thought, but I did want to say, if I may say experientially, that the insight simultaneously coming up with contact in a meditative absorption, something experiential occurs. Sort of like like if we say the equation 2 + 2 = 4, there's a little process that's happening to get to 4. But sometimes I would say experientially, insight seems to give all that information at once in a nonverbal, not necessarily logical sequence. But there's an understanding that comes up, and then as my agency arises back, a natural, calm, flexible mind comes in with agency to look at that insight that was sort of delivering a complete package. I'm not saying it's always this way, but sometimes the jhana is like a delivery of comprehensive experience, an experience that I'm not sure this is where I should take this conversation, but I was going to say experientially that it seems like insight to me delivers a full, complete experiential package that comes with understanding, hence the knowledge component. But then when the mind comes up, it still has pliability. My mind, when my agency comes up, it's very gentle, and then it can look back and we'll try to make a sequence of what happened and analyze it. And then finally I'll come out quite grossly. And I was just going to ask if sustained thought is still, when it comes to vitakka vichara, I know you've said vichara can be this type of investigation that's very fine. And so I was thinking, when you described it, I was thinking this is one reason I like the translation sustained thought, because now the mind has found its object and it's no longer wandering. It still needs a little help, so we're sustaining it there. And then eventually it sticks itself there. So is sustained thought still a translation you would accept of vichara?
I've used examination afterwards. But I have to point out, it's not examination in the sense of a discursive examination in order to understand the object, which would be leading into insight, into wisdom. But it's just, I don't know how to put this otherwise, but looking at the object. So vitakka applies the mind. That's the way it's explained. Abhiniropana, lifting and putting the mind onto the object. And then vichara just continues to look at the object.
Yeah.
My memory for names is Ken, was that your name? Chris, okay, that's right.
Thank you. It sounds like in your description of vitakka and vichara, you're just referring to the redirection of one's attention.
To
the redirection of one's attention to the object.
Not the redirection of one's attention. That would be the function amongst the mental factors of attention.
Yeah, but your description sounds to me just like direction of one's attention to the object.
Yeah.
So is it different from that, or?
Well, what directs the attention to the object would be, in terms of mental factors, the one here called attention. This is manasikara.
Yeah. So how is vitakka and vichara different from directing and sustaining one's attention on the object? Yeah.
I would say that, when it comes to just differentiating these subtle mental factors, it gets very difficult. But what I would say is that vitakka is what applies the mind to the object. So even when one has been observing the same object for some time, but it's vitakka which is constantly metaphorically lifting the mind and putting it onto the object. So for example, if one is take mindfulness of breathing. So I would say that it is vitakka which is constantly taking the mind, in a sense, and putting it on the breath. It would be attention which turns the mind to the breath, but then vitakka is applying the mind to the breath. Then vichara, you would say, well, vitakka is applying the mind, and it's something that's taking place repeatedly. It's not just that vitakka applies the mind and then drops away, but as one is, say, being mindful of breathing in, breathing out, vitakka is constantly putting the mind onto the breath, keeping the mind onto the breath, and then I'd say that it's vichara, which is looking at the function of the mind, looking at itself on the breath, to ensure that the mind is on the breath, and to be looking at the breath itself. That's the way I would just distinguish their functions. But I remember there was a book, it was an early translation of the Manual of Abhidhamma, Abhidhammata Sangaha, the one from the Pali Text Society called Compendium of Philosophy. And there was an appendix to that by Mrs. Rhys Davids, or her co-translator, who was a Burmese, Aung Se, something, a Burmese name. And they had also found a problem with differentiating vitakka, that's applied thought, from manasikara, from attention. And so they wrote to Lady Soyador, who was a famous Burmese, both scholar, monk, and meditation master, for him to clarify the difference. So if you find a copy of that Compendium of Philosophy, I don't remember how he did it, but I remember that they bring up that question in the appendix.
Okay, thank you.
On the distinction between vitakka and manasikara. So it's the two come very close together, so one needs a very sharp wisdom to be able to differentiate them. Maybe my wisdom is too blunt.
Okay, I do have another question.
Yeah.
According to the suttas, is it necessary to have an object to anchor one's mind to in order to enter jhana, like the breath or like a kasina? Or can one just kind of like let go into a jhanic state and maybe focus on the factors of the jhana itself?
I don't think focusing on the jhana factors would be the way to enter the jhana. But what I found is that there's ways to do meditation in which one is not, focusing upon a specific object, but just whatever comes in the mind, one just lets it go, lets it go, lets it go. Then the mind gets into a very serene, even concentrated state. So it seems almost like a jhanic state.
And then the jhana factors can naturally arise at that point, like
It would
piti
seem so.
arise, yeah.
Now technically the mind would have to have an object in that case, since, according to, well, even the explanation we get in the suttas, that consciousness always has an object. There's no such thing as an objectless consciousness. Mm-hmm. But it seems here that the mind doesn't have a single, specific object that it's focusing on. So maybe what I would say is that maybe the object in that case might be the luminosity of the mind itself. Okay. It seems that aspect of meditation maybe gets more emphasized or comes to more prominence within some of the Tibetan systems of meditation. Like from what I've heard, Mahamudra, maybe Dzogchen.
Thank you.
See you.
Thanks, Bhante. Bhante, in this description of the mental content that's present, or that was analyzed by Venerable Sariputta, I remember even the panya, the wisdom, is a chetasika, mental.
Right. Yeah.
How come that's not?
How come that's not mentioned here?
Yeah.
Yeah, we have to remember that panya gets included as a mental factor when we have like the full-blown Abhidhamma system for analyzing a state of consciousness. Now here, in this sutta, it's, again, I have to say what seems to me to be the case, like this represents a transitional stage of development from the early layer of the suttas, where you have the jhana, what's mentioned as the jhana factors. In the early layer of the suttas would be just 5 factors: applied thought, sustained thought, rapture, blissful feeling, and one-pointedness of mind. So now it's evolving into a more complex understanding of the jhanic state by including this group of 5 factors, beginning with contact, and then adding some other factors, zeal, energy, mindfulness, equanimity, attention. So it's evolving in that direction. But probably it took, maybe a few more generations when, the Buddhist thinkers were then trying to consider what are all of the factors present in the first jhana. And then they would come to the decision, well, there has to be some kind of wisdom there. And so we put that in.
The other question is, it seems like here what's been really described is how Venerable Sariputta actually penetrated the jhana itself by looking at it, dividing it. But in order to do that, Venerable Sariputta was able to kind of, as you said, turn back and see the mind itself that's been observing this jhana state. Or rather, the mind itself, he's able to turn back. And when he turns back, actually he sees, I don't know how come it was not emphasized, but he sees that it arises and passing away, and he realizes that whatever arises, they pass away, they vanish.
Yeah.
Now, that seems to me like a higher wisdom.
A very.
A higher wisdom,
Yeah.
deep wisdom.
Yeah.
Is that, was Venerable Sariputta able to see that wisdom by even penetrating the jhana itself? Was it because he was already a stream enterer, or any layperson could analyze the jhana in this fashion by kind of looking back on his mind itself and seeing the dissolving nature of this mind content?
I would say that it doesn't depend upon prior attainment of any, stage of realization. It doesn't depend on the attainment of stream entry. Maybe because Sariputta was a stream enterer, and even by his own nature, he already had very highly developed faculty of wisdom. So he was able to see, to dissect the experience of jhana in such, fine detail. But the ability to see the arising and the passing away of the jhanic factors wouldn't require prior attainment of a stage like stream entry. It would require just a very, very strong development of, I would say, of mindfulness and clear comprehension of sati sampajanya. Okay, 232, we've already done. Even if jhana is not necessary to attain stream entry, the jhanas are still mandatory for full liberation, correct? Again, these are sort of controversial questions. There are some suttas which describe the movement to arahantship, or full liberation, and whenever they're expounded by explaining first that the meditator enters the jhana, then he contemplates the jhana with insight, and then through contemplating the jhana with insight, he attains arahantship, or sometimes the stage of non-returner. Then there's one sutta which we discussed maybe last year, number 64 in the Majjhima Nikaya, where the Buddha says, this is the path to eliminating the 5 lower fetters, and it's impossible to eliminate the 5 lower fetters without taking this path. And when the Buddha expounds this, he goes through the jhanas, and with each jhana, the monk contemplates the factors of the jhana as basically impermanent, suffering, non-self, and then reaches either arahantship or non-returning. So if one takes those suttas as one's authority, then one says, sometimes a bit dogmatically, it's necessary to achieve jhana in order to gain arahantship. But then there's a sutta like the Satipatthana Sutta, in which jhana doesn't seem to play a particularly important role at all, even if it doesn't even seem to be necessary. And on the basis of the Satipatthana Sutta, the Buddha says, if one practices like this for 7 years, actually from 7 days down to 7 years, I guarantee you one of 2 results, either arahantship or non-returning. So it seems to me that the suttas are not unequivocal, not unanimous, but there may be different voices or different ways of looking at the issue. And so I hesitate to make pronouncements that this is absolutely mandatory. What we could say is mandatory for full liberation is insight into impermanent suffering non-self. Of course, if one gains jhana and then bases the insight on the jhana, probably it will be much smoother road. But it's also possible that just by following the method of the Satipatthana Sutta very rigorously, one could go through all of the stages of insight and come out to arahantship without jhana. Then, next question, does the canon ever classify the mind consciousness as active doer, passive knower? Apply and sustain thoughts a still function of the doer component? No, I don't recall any distinction in mind consciousness between active doer and passive knower. Maybe somebody else knows a passage like that, but it doesn't come to my mind.
I think that's a distinction that John Kabat-Zinn tends to make. The knowing and being, or doing and being mode. But I don't think it's, I don't know that there's a sutta.
Anyway, I don't recall anything like that from the suttas. Okay.
Yeah, so back to that insight practice, the case of the dry insight practitioners.
Yeah.
So what Venerable Guru Tana said, that there's a kind of concentration called momentary concentration.
Yeah.
Is this some kind of special jhana aside from the classic jhanas described in the suttas? The momentary concentration.
Okay, momentary concentration, the expression is used in two senses. One is, as one is approaching towards jhana, then it's just a moment of, well, we say a moment of samadhi in which the five hindrances subside and the mind becomes fixed upon the object, but one comes out of it after a moment. So that's momentary concentration in relation to the samatha or serenity mode of meditation. Now, in relation to insight meditation, momentary concentration has a somewhat different meaning. This is the kind of concentration that arises from mindfully attending to the different objects of experience that arise moment after moment when one is doing insight meditation. So as one is attending to each object that arises, whether it be bodily phenomena, mental phenomena, one is making the mental note of that phenomena. And as one is doing so, the mind is becoming more and more focused upon the changing stream of experience. And so whatever arises from moment to moment is being noted, being observed. And so in this way, the mind enters into a state of concentration on the ever-changing flux of experience, so that it's always noting every object, always aware of every object. And so it's a state of samadhi, which is somewhat similar to what is called access concentration, the concentration approaching the jhana. But because the object is always changing from moment to moment, it doesn't become a fixed concentration like the concentration in serenity meditation. And so it's not that one is just concentrated for a moment and then the mind becomes distracted, but the mind is continuously concentrated, but it's concentrated on an object or on a stream of objects that are always changing. And so because the object is different from moment to moment, it's called momentary concentration.
So is it safe to say that for the momentary concentration of the insight route, the first four jhana factors are present, but not the fifth one. The fifth one is the single-mindedness.
Even single-mindedness, one could say, is present. One-pointedness of mind is present. Because the mind is fixed one-pointedly on whatever object is present. But it's just that, unlike in samadhi meditation it's the same object, the breath, or actually it's the sign that arises based on the breath. Or it could be this kasina, the colored disc. So it's always the same object. But in the momentary concentration, it's always a changing object. But the mind is fixed one-pointedly upon that object, whatever it is. So all five of the jhana factors are present. But because the object is ever changing, the concentration doesn't reach the steadiness or depth of the jhana concentration.
Bhante, earlier you mentioned that there is a way that one could keep, disengaging or letting go, letting go whatever that comes, and then there is a deep concentration or deep state. So that sounds to me very interesting, because the mind is always, it needs something to put its step on.
Yeah.
Now, but you are saying there is a way to keep taking whatever where it puts the foot, you keep taking that away. You keep taking away where it wants to get established. And yet you were able to, or rather, a person is able to reach a deep samadhi state.
Yeah.
So what is that samadhi state?
I don't know a name for it. And maybe there are different samadhi states depending upon the exact way in which one goes about this process. There is a samadhi which is referred to in the suttas and never clearly explained, which is called the signless concentration, animitta samadhi. Perhaps this is the animitta samadhi.
But animitta, that's like three. Is that the same as the way one gets to the way? Okay, what I've heard is one can access nibbana through three directions.
Yeah, there's something called the three doors to deliverance.
Yeah, is that the same as the animitta samadhi or something else?
To my knowledge, or to my recollection, the expression animitta samadhi is not always used in that context. Sometimes it occurs independent of that context. The expression does occur in relation to the three, what later comes to be called the three doors to deliverance. This is the door of the signless samadhi, emptiness samadhi, and desireless samadhi, which again are not actually explained clearly in the suttas. It's only, I think, in the works like Visuddhimagga and commentaries that they're explained as the stage of samadhi that occurs through insight, directly preceding the entrance to the supramundane path. But in the suttas, they're just left unexplained. Okay, when I say that one can enter into a kind of samadhi just by letting go whatever arises, I'm not saying that the mind doesn't have any object at all, because technically the mind has to have some object. There has to be some object of awareness. It's just that this approach to samadhi doesn't involve fixing the mind upon one single object, like the breath or a kasina object or the bodily sensations or whatever. But well, the way I've done this is just to focus on the mind itself and then whatever arises, one just lets it go, lets it go, lets it go, without sort of fixing onto anything that arises. And at a certain point, it seems that all the content of the mind which has been arising just sort of breaks off or settles down, and then there's just a kind of clear awareness without, a fixed object of awareness. So there has to be some object. So what I would say is that it could be just maybe the luminous nature of the mind itself, or just awareness itself as the object.
So then, Bhante, does that consciousness, unestablished consciousness or something that you mentioned, what is that? Is that connected to?
The unestablished consciousness.
It's you mentioned it appears in Digha Nikaya at one place.
Oh, this is Vijnanang Anidasanang
Anidasana Vijnana Bhante.
Ananto Sabato Pabhang. Okay, Vijnanang Anidasanang, consciousness, which is Anidasana, again, different interpretations of that. I'll explain my interpretation. Vijnanang Anidasanang, Anantang, boundless, infinite, Anantang, Sabato Pabhang, luminous on all sides. Okay, I understand this to be Vijnanang Anidasanang. I take Anidasana, I would translate it non-manifesting. And so then the question comes up, what is this consciousness? The Buddha says that no conditioned object gets a foothold in that kind of consciousness. I take that to be, this is a rather technical concept, but I take that to be the consciousness of the arahat in what's called the attainment of fruition. That's a special meditative attainment that the arahat enters, in which he is experiencing nibbana. And so that consciousness is not nibbana itself. So some interpreters, some commentators, or modern writers take that consciousness to be nibbana. And so they say nibbana is a kind of consciousness. But I take that consciousness not to be identical with nibbana, but it is the consciousness of the arhat when he's in the special meditative absorption in which he's experiencing nibbana. And it's called non-anidasana, non-manifesting, because it doesn't manifest any of the conditioned phenomena of the world. And I think one finds that state of consciousness described in a number of suttas towards the end of the Anguttara Nikaya, Book of Tens, maybe around the first chapter of the Book of Tens, and the Book of 11s, the first chapter. It's within the first 10 suttas in the Book of Tens, Book of 11s. And so Ananda comes to the Buddha and says, is it possible, O Bhante, for a monk to achieve such a state of samadhi in which he is not aware of earth, water, fire, and wind, not aware of the base of infinite space, infinite consciousness, base of nothingness, base of neither perception nor non-perception, not aware of this world, not aware of the world beyond, and yet he is still aware. And then the Buddha says, there is Ananda. So the Buddha says, there is Ananda, and how is there such a state of samadhi? Here the monk is conscious thus. This is the peaceful, this is the sublime, that is the stilling of all conditioned phenomena, sabba sankhara samato, sabbupati pati nisago, the relinquishing of all bases of attachment, dispassion, cessation, nibbana. And that is how the monk enters that samadhi. So I take that, the mind in that samadhi, to be the consciousness which is anidasanang anantang sabbato babang, which is non-manifesting, boundless, luminous on all sides.
And animitta samadhi you mentioned is different or the same?
As I said, the animitta samadhi is not so, it's not explicitly defined in the suttas. It's just, actually there is a way that is characterized, but it's not, I think it's in sutta number 43, where it's called actually the signless liberation. Okay, it's on page 393, paragraph 27. This is a conversation between Sariputta and another monk, Mahakotita. I think Mahakotita is asking questions to Sariputta. So he says, how many conditions are there for the attainment of the signless deliverance of mind? The Sariputta says there are two conditions for the attainment of the signless deliverance of mind. One is non-attention to all, here it's called signs, nimitta, you could say objects, and attention to the signless element. These are the two conditions for the attainment of the signless deliverance of mind. What is the signless element? There's a note, let's see. Then the note says, this is the attainment of fruition. The signs are objects such as forms, etc. And the signless element is nibbana, in which all the signs of conditioned things are absent. Okay, maybe we take one more question then. Well, I saw two hands go up, so we'll take this gentleman here and then. You are Hong, is that your name? Okay. If you would take the microphone, it would help with the recording.
I want to ask, I guess one a simple question and one maybe a more complex, but simple question is, what was the sutta's number for the Buddha's and Sariputta's first encounter when Sariputta goes to the Buddha that you described it in?
It comes in the Vinaya Pitaka, the book of discipline. It's one of the books of the Vinaya Pitaka is called the Mahavagga. But you'll find the same, you'll find that account. This is not a plug for promotion, but there's a book called Great Disciples of the Buddha.
Yes.
Of course, you don't need the whole Mahavagga of the Vinaya Pitaka, which goes into a lot of detail of monastic regulations. Yes. But you get, that story has been included in the book, a paperback. It's called The Great Disciples of the Buddha.
Yes. One
One chapter is the life of Sariputta. Then it has the story of that incident.
I think that some of the confusion that this discussion reveals about jhana may be reduced by two considerations. To try, I hope this doesn't sound presumptuous. Hope this doesn't sound presumptuous. But to remember that the object under the Four Noble Truths, the second noble truth, to uproot craving.
Yeah.
And I think if we relate our meditation experience or attempts at meditation and how effective it is in uprooting the craving, then that will be the test, not which rarefied state we're in, but how effective it is for us in uprooting the craving. And then I would remind what I think of is the story of when Buddha points that when he stopped the terrible ascetic practices, he remembered the mind state of a child under the apple blossoms. And I would say that if we followed that example, it might be easier for us.
Yeah. So that experience under the rose apple tree was the experience of the first jhana.
Yes, but maybe think of the rose apple tree more than the jhana.
And I think Hong, so you'll get the last question.
Before my last question, I actually found the Anguttara reference. It's 10.6. And it says that that fruition attainment is not jhana-based nor formless attainment. It looks like some kind of heavy-duty, quite advanced stage.
Wait, it's referring to what?
The signless concentration state. And your footnote says, the attainment is not the fruition of what occurs for a few moments immediately following the path, but a special meditative state accessible only to those who have already attained one of the four paths and fruition. Looks like it's a quite advanced state of meditation. The attainment as shown in this sutta does not take any of the mundane conditioned meditation objects as its support. Its support is the unconditioned nibbana experienced directly and immediately. So it's quite heavy duty to me.
Okay, anyway, this is getting a little too rarefied for my...
Anyway, my last question would be regarding the stream enterer. They're defined as having at most 7 more lives.
Yeah.
But that shouldn't be unique to stream enterers, right?
But what?
The 7 more lives.
Yeah.
That should not be unique to stream enterers, right? Because the Dhammanusari, the truth follower and the faith followers, the sutta said that, they won't be able to pass away until they reach the fruit of stream entry right in the same lifetime.
Yeah.
So that means that truth followers and faith followers also have at most 7 more lives.
Yeah.
It's not exclusive to stream enterer.
Well, the thing is that they're going to, at the time of their death, they're going to be stream enterers. So from looking at it from the point of view of how many lives you get after you die, then there's 7 more.
But is it always true that truth follower and faith followers, they always attain stream entry in the same lifetime?
Yeah, that's what's said in the sutta.
Okay. Thus, they also have 7 more lives.
Yeah, you could say that, Okay, then I think we'll stop for the day. Wow, it's 1:15. This is... Since we started 12:25, this is quite I'll have to apply for overtime. No, overtime! We have to form a union. Okay, we end with 3 bows. Okay, 1. Okay, thank you for your patience under these trying conditions of having to move from our regular home.